They left Ghana the way they always did. 18 traders, men and women, crossing the border into Burkina Faso to buy tomatoes and onions. It was a journey their families had made for generations. The route was familiar. The risk, they thought, was manageable. They never came home. On February 14, 2026, in the town of Titao, northern Burkina Faso, militants from JNIM, an al-Qaeda-affiliated group, carried out a coordinated assault. They targeted a military camp. They destroyed telecommunications infrastructure. They looted and burnt shops and supply trucks. And in the middle of all of this was a truck carrying 18 Ghanaian traders. The militants separated the men from the women. Then they opened fire on the men. 8 Ghanaians were killed. 7 died on the spot. An 8th later succumbed to his injuries. The women were spared. They watched the men die. They watched the burials the next day, because the bodies had already begun to decompose in the heat. This is not a statistic. These were human beings. They had families. They had names. They had children waiting for them to come home. This is the story of that tragedy. And it is also the story of what happened next, how 8 lives lost became the catalyst for a diplomatic breakthrough that had been years in the making. This is Voice of Africa. Saturday, February 14th, 2026. The town of Titao in northern Burkina Faso. Witnesses say the attackers divided into 3 groups. One group targeted a military camp. Another destroyed telephone facilities. A third looted and burnt shops and supply trucks. In the chaos, a truck carrying 18 Ghanaian traders was caught. They were there for the same reason Ghanaian traders have always gone north, to buy tomatoes and onions. Burkina Faso is a major source of these goods for Ghanaian markets. According to the president of the Tomato and Onion Truck Drivers Association, here is what happened next. The militants separated the men from the women. Then they opened fire. 8 Ghanaians were killed. 7 died immediately. The 8th died later from his injuries. The women were forced to watch the burials the next day. The bodies had already begun to decompose in the heat. On February 16th, JNIM claimed responsibility for the assault. Ghana's interior minister confirmed the casualties. He described the information as disturbing. The Ghana embassy in Burkina Faso immediately began liaising with local authorities to secure the site and identify the victims. Now here is where the story turns, because the Ghanaian government did not wait. Within 24 hours, officials confirmed the casualties. On Tuesday, February 17th, just 3 days after the attack, the Ghana Air Force evacuated 3 injured survivors to the 37 military hospital in Accra. President John Dramani Mahama visited them in the hospital. He condemned the attack. That is the immediate response. That is what we expect from a government when its citizens are killed abroad. Condolences, evacuations, condemnation. But something else was happening behind the scenes, something that would lead to a diplomatic breakthrough that surprised everyone. Joseph Paddy, Public Relations Officer of the Ghana Union of Traders Association, captured the mood of the moment. "We are deeply concerned about the safety of our market women who travel across borders," he said. "If our women are going to be threatened by these insurgents, it is a worrying situation. If we are not careful, it will reduce trade volumes between Ghana and Burkina Faso." Following the attack, the National Tomato Traders Association and the Transporters Association suspended tomato imports from Burkina Faso. Paddy warned that the suspension had already resulted in shortages and sharp price increases in Ghanaian markets. As a result of the suspension, tomatoes have become scarce and very expensive. Transport owners are refusing to travel. This is affecting businesses, trade, and the economy as a whole. Here is what you need to understand. The attack on February 14th did not happen in a vacuum, and the diplomatic response did not start from scratch. Ghana and Burkina Faso already had a channel open. In October 2025, months before the attack, technical experts from both countries had held preparatory meetings. The Permanent Joint Commission for Cooperation between Ghana and Burkina Faso had been dormant for 6 years, but it was scheduled to meet. The groundwork was already being laid. What the attack did was inject urgency. It turned what might have taken another year of bureaucratic scheduling into a 1-week diplomatic sprint. because when your citizens are dying on foreign soil, you cannot afford to wait. On February 20th, 2026, just 6 days after the attack, Ghana's Foreign Minister Samuel Okudzeto Ablakwa stood at a podium in Ouagadougou. Beside him was Burkina Faso's Foreign Minister Karamoko Jean-Marie Traoré, and together they announced that 7 bilateral agreements had been signed. 7 agreements, in 1 week. Let us walk through what they actually are, because the substance matters. Number 1. A joint security cooperation framework, now under active negotiation. This is about intelligence sharing, joint patrols, coordinated counterterrorism operations along the border corridor, not vague statements. Operational reality. Number 2. Mutual recognition of driver's licenses along the Tema-Ouagadougou trade corridor. This sounds small, but if you are a truck driver who has spent hours at checkpoints dealing with regulatory friction, you know this is a big deal. Number 3. A transport and road transit agreement to facilitate movement of goods and people. Number 4. A framework agreement on cross-border cooperation, formal structures for both governments to coordinate on issues affecting border communities. Number 5. A memorandum establishing periodic consultations between border administrative authorities. Number 6. A memorandum creating a joint commission to reaffirm the Ghana-Burkina Faso land border. Certainty, clarity, no ambiguity about where one country ends and the other begins. Number 7. A cooperation agreement to combat illicit drug trafficking. On top of these 7, they also agreed on new protocols for joint disaster management, specifically addressing the Bagre Dam flooding that has affected communities in both countries for years. Minister Ablakwa said these agreements are not going to be decorative pieces. He said they have discussed strategies for immediate implementation. Now let us give you the context that makes this even more significant. Burkina Faso, under Captain Ibrahim Traoré, has walked away from ECOWAS. They have joined the alliance of Sahel states. Many West African countries have kept their distance. But Ghana has been different. On the diplomatic front, Ghana has consistently refused to isolate Burkina Faso. President Mahama and Captain Traoré had already met in January and March of 2025. Those meetings set the tone for renewed bilateral cooperation. The Permanent Joint Commission for Cooperation, dormant for 6 years, was reactivated because of that high-level political will. They have kept the channel open. They have kept talking. And these 7 agreements are the result. That matters. It matters because it shows that African countries do not have to choose one alliance over another. It matters because it shows that practical cooperation on security and trade can continue even when political alignments shift. Back home in Ghana, the tragedy has sparked a different kind of conversation. People are asking, why are Ghanaian traders traveling deep into the Sahel to buy tomatoes? Why are we so dependent on cross-border agricultural imports? The dominant sentiment is this. If Ghana invested properly in domestic farming and irrigation, our citizens would not need to put their lives on the line to source food from conflict zones. Joseph Paddy from the Traders Association warned that the suspension of tomato imports has already created shortages and price hikes. If we are not careful, it will reduce trade volumes between Ghana and Burkina Faso, he said. The government has announced plans for full-scale domestic tomato production. Will it happen? We do not know. But we will be watching. Before we wrap this up, we must come back to something. We have talked about agreements. We have talked about diplomacy. We have talked about security frameworks and trade corridors. But none of this happens in the abstract. It happens because 8 people went to buy tomatoes and never came home. 7 of them were buried the next day because the bodies had already begun to decompose. The surviving women watched those burials. They watched their colleagues, their friends, their fellow travelers lowered into the ground. Ghana's Interior Minister explained that the women who sustained minor or no injuries were asked to witness the burial of the dead to capture and document the process. That is the human reality behind these 7 agreements. That is why urgency matters. That is why implementation matters. Because when the next attack comes, and it will come, people need to know that their governments have done more than sign papers. So, what happens now? Watch whether these 7 agreements are actually implemented. Minister Ablakwa promised immediate action. We will hold him to it. Watch whether the joint security frameworks get operationalized. Watch whether the driver's license recognition actually removes bottlenecks at checkpoints. Watch whether the Bagre Dam protocols prevent future flooding. And watch whether Ghana follows through on that promise of domestic tomato production. Because if they do, it changes the equation entirely. The question for all of us is this: do these agreements gather dust on a shelf, or do they become the foundation for a new kind of West African cooperation, one that protects both citizens and their economic livelihoods? 8 lives were lost, 7 agreements were signed, and we are watching what comes next. This is what Voice of Africa does. We tell the stories that others skip. We connect the tragedy to the breakthrough. We remind you that behind every agreement, there are people. If you believe these stories matter, share this video. Send it to someone who needs to understand what is really happening in West Africa. Subscribe to Voice of Africa. Every week, we trace the new lines being drawn across the African map. Not just the borders, but the bonds of cooperation being forged in the face of tragedy. And comment below. Where are you watching from? Ouagadougou, Accra, Niamey, Lagos, London, New York. Let us see the full map of this community. Let us prove that the diaspora is watching, that the continent is listening, and that the story of African cooperation is being written, not in press releases, but in the blood of those we have lost and the agreements that seek to honor them. The Titao tragedy is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a new chapter, and we are all watching to see how it is written. Voice of Africa. New lines, new narratives, new Africa.